Conference of Parties 27, commonly known as COP27, brought over 200 leaders from across the world to share ideas and solutions on the climate change issues affecting the world. Some of the issues discussed were climate finance, food insecurity, global warming, amongst others. One of the major outcomes was the agreement to provide loss and damage funding for vulnerable countries hit hard by climate change, such as rising sea levels. But critics have said that the COP27 UN summit in Egypt did not go far enough on cutting the emissions that cause climate change. Joining us via Zoom is an environmentalist and the executive director of African Network for Environment and Economic Justice, David Ugolor. Good morning and thanks for joining us on TVC Breakfast. All right, David, we can't hear you. I don't know if you can hear me.
I say good morning. Greetings from Benin.
All right. Thank you for joining us once again. Now, from reports, critics have said that the COP27 UN summit in Egypt did not go far enough at cutting the emissions that cause climate change, despite coming up with the loss and the establishment of loss and damage fund. What do you think happened?
Thank you again for inviting me to participate in your program, and it's a real privilege. What happened in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt was unfortunate, but we have to make do with what was available. Like you rightly noted, the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, like the UN Secretary General rightly noted, is an opportunity for justice messaging. It's a call for justice. And establishing that fund again send the right political signal that the world have come to acknowledge the injustice caused by climate change around the world. And as you also know, like they say, put your mouth where your money is. The fund realized from this commitment is nothing to write home about, considering the cumulative negative impact of climate change around the world. So why will I say that what happened in Sharm el-Sheikh wasn't really too good for Africa? Because like the COP27 was tagged African COP, but what really came out of it, does it really benefit Africa? Not really. And as you know, the Loss and Damage Fund established is still at the critical stage. We are yet to know what it will really entails and what fund that is available for it to implement some of the objectives why it was established. And so they are still in the pipeline. Let's see what happens as we move to the next COP next year. But at this point in time, we acknowledge the justice element of this fund, because it's a struggle that's come long way from almost 10 years. And some of us, we see it as an opportunity to again acknowledge that the people's voice triumphed in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Why do you think it didn't benefit Africa? Was it that Africa could not negotiate to get something that was good enough for the continent?
And there were a lot of factors that were responsible for these uncertainties that overshadowed the COP27. Like you know, the Russia-Ukraine war has brought another different narrative around the need to move towards alternative renewable energy. And the world interests have shifted entirely away from Africa towards the Ukraine war. And as you see, European unions are out grappling under the energy crisis caused by the Ukraine war. And obviously, the US government, Canadian government, other developed countries, their interests have also shifted along that line. And that, again, was unfortunate for COP27. And obviously, because of this shift of interest, and the European unions are looking for alternative energy. And thankfully enough, gas was seen as an opportunity in Africa. But unfortunately, the infrastructure to produce this is not there, and we're all looking towards an alternative energy that is sustainable, that is renewable. And rather than focusing on this, the European Union needs a short-term action to keep to the crisis they are facing because of the Ukraine war. And more interest is now more focused on fossil fuel And obviously, the oil companies and multinational oil company took an advantage of this to swamp into Sharm el-Sheikh and came with over 600 lobbyists. And so the outcome of the Egypt meeting, the COP27, reflected mostly the interest of this oil company rather than the interest of Africans who are currently facing the crisis of the global warming.
Walk us through the whole battle for compensation, what was called loss and damage during the conference. Walk us through. It was a lot of contention. A lot of many countries did not want to agree as to whether there should be even compensation or for all the depredations that the West and industrial world have done to the environment. They created what we have today. And then there was also the fact that it took a negotiation that went till wee hours of the next morning before they eventually agreed, and that was because U.S. agreed, and they got to that point. Nobody has agreed how much yet, and there's also contention as to if the industrial countries are supposed to be the ones that will pay, where will you classify China? Will China be one of those that will pay? China doesn't want to be one of those, although China is supposed to be number one emitter of fossil fuel now. Walk us through this whole controversy.
Well, as you know, there's always this controversy around who constitutes the developed country and developing country. China and India, no doubt, has currently emerged as a very powerful countries that obviously look into their GDP and their economy. You will agree that they should also be seen as a developed country, but unfortunately, they are resisting that tagging. And that has been a source of contention in all the negotiations around the COP. And obviously, that again rears head in this COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and that was a contentious area. And so the issue of who now constitute the developed country that will now have to fund, because it also shows clearly that the developed countries are looking for a way to expand those who will be paying for supporting this kind of vulnerable fund that have now been established, what you tag the lose and damage fund. And obviously they're looking towards China and India contributing to such fund. But unfortunately, it's not going down well with these two countries, and they're resisting it, and became an area of contention. And that, I am sure, will continue to guide the conversation as we move towards next year, COP28. But in any case, the whole issue around compensation, the U.S. Special Envoy on climate change was very clear. Kerry was very clear in his explanation, even though he put that at the last 9 minutes because of COVID problem, that the challenge, we have to be very clear about what this lose and damage fund will deal with. It's not about reparation. They are very careful. They're trying to avoid taking responsibility of damage, because obviously when you add that kind of language or narrative, individuals and communities will probably take an advantage of it to embark on litigation and holding those companies accountable for the damages they have caused across the continent. Take, for example, our backyard, Ogoni land. And obviously, this is what also informed the decision why over 80 NGOs from Nigeria signed up an open letter calling on the investors, multinational oil company, and governments to take responsibility for the loss and damages caused by the oil operations in the Niger Delta area. It's only when you visit this area that you will experience, you will see firsthand. And that became aggravated with the recent flooding that has wiped almost the entire community in Bayelsa, Rivers, and across the coastal area in the Niger Delta region. This, for me, is something that we need to acknowledge. And it's not just Nigeria. Pakistan also had a feel of this flood crisis. And these are all caused by the climate change. And who are the major contributors for this climate change problem? Are the developed country. But unfortunately, they are not matching their words, their actions in dealing with this challenge. For example, the 100 billion annually promised for tackling some of these challenges is yet to come. And it's even surprising, and this was one of the poor ranking in the Sharm El-Sheikh in Egypt, that even as they were rounding up their meeting yesterday, that it's less than 500 million euro that was realized for this vulnerable fund, which was going for few countries that was selected for this. So let's keep our finger crossed that even though this fund has been announced and with the transition committee put in place, and that as civil society, our voice will continue to be raised around these issues, our eyes keep on what goes on and what will come out. And then African countries, again, one of the poor outcome of this was that the civic space was shrinked. And as you know, the human rights record of the host country, who is currently the presidency, is not very good. And that also denied the voices and the opportunity for human rights groups and environmentalists from around the world to take an advantage of the space to demand. But obviously, oil companies and multinational oil companies had their way in this COP27. And that for me is the unfortunate low point of the COP27.
There are those who are questioning what countries, especially African countries, for instance, will do with these monies, and that it's not going to change anything, and it's not going to get to the root of the issues. What can countries do with these monies when they get them? That pollution will still continue, and these organizations that keep up polluting the environment will continue and just be dishing out funds. How do we get justice? How do we hold them accountable when they are given monies?
Well, I completely agree with the fears that you have expressed, that the issue of governance, corruption issues is a big one across the continent, particularly the developing country. But like I said, it takes two to tango. It's not just the African countries or the developing countries that are afflicted with this problem. The multinational companies are also involved. The recent Glencoe corruption cases across African countries speaks to this fact. And it will also interest you to note that even at the high point when they were to launch African Energy Access, considering the fact that over 600 million Nigerian Africans don't have access to electricity, most of the key stakeholders pulled out because of the involvement of one of the key stakeholders who was involved in corruption that was facing prosecution in New York. So the issue of corruption is a big problem, no doubt. It's a big challenge. And so, but let's get there first. The fund has been announced. Let's see how the architecture looks like and then who is contributing. Because if you are to take the past into consideration, the developed country has not really performed to the extent to which they should be taken very seriously. Because if you look the promises they've made in previous COP, the fund hasn't been there. So now we talk about even the issue of governance or corruption. Let's make the fund available and then put in place the right institutional framework that will guarantee a proper utilization. Then Africans, the issue of assessing this fund, they have to put their house in order, no doubt. Countries like Nigeria who want to assess this kind of fund must be ready to put in place a framework like the NDC framework that will help send the right political signal that they are prepared to use this money if eventually come for the right environmental mitigation or adaptation programs that will help address the Paris Agreement issues. But let me also remind you that countries in Africa are actually doing the best they can, falling within the capacity they can deal with. But the crisis that you have seen in Ukraine is also putting the power imbalance, because obviously you can see the German chancellor flew into Africa. With such kind of powerful country coming into the continent, it's difficult for the African country to resist the gas politics. And why you see that also having a major influence in the outcome document in Egypt For instance, we were expecting that the fossil fuel will be phased out because this is a major contributor to the gas flaring and the gases that contributes to the climate change crisis. But rather than seeing that happening in the outcome document, we see the watering down of such wording, particularly in the area now using phase down instead of phase out of fossil fuel. This is really, really troubling. Troubling in the sense that Africans didn't have their way in this summit and this conference. And that for me, as a result of power imbalance that you found between developed and developing countries. And so African countries need to put their house in order, and the multinational companies that are involved in corrupt practices need to also be checkmate, like Glencoe and other oil producing companies like commodities like Glencoe's and others. And then the global international financial institutions need to also be strengthened, because you cannot also discount the fact that when the financial system is not clean, all shady deals will continue. And companies that are involved in greenwashing will take an advantage of it, just like what has happened in Jamshed. Companies who are involved in greenwashing have taken advantage because they have the lobbying power, they have the resources, and they have the capacity to lobby, to have their way. And unfortunately, the presidency for the COP this year has put in place a system that has helped raise this kind of bar to the next level. But my call is that African countries, like what the G7 countries did in making sure that the lose and damage have their way this time around, we should begin to mobilize as we move into the next COP28. Begin to build forces together. And that is the only way we can begin to translate some of the outcome of this current COP27 into reality and having impact on people's life.
All right, Reverend, I like when you talk about the need to begin to mobilize amongst the G7 countries, especially when it comes to Africa. Because this $100 billion, it seems that money, even if it's going to come, might take a very long time. Before then, a lot of Africans would have died from the impacts of the climate change. Now, let's talk about the issue of adaptation. You know, the commitments from the issue of flood defenses to regrowing the forests and all of that. These are realities with us right here, especially on the African continent. What and how should we begin to make the move? Because we saw Kogi State has not recovered from the issue of floods. Bayelsa State has not recovered. Jigawa State and so many other states, even Lagos. We are all facing the impacts of this realities right now. What practical steps can African countries begin to take to try to mitigate these things on their own before the assistance that they're expecting from developed countries or industrialized countries?
Thank you, my brother. I'm not a fan of aid dependency at all. No, you have to put your house in order. For example, the flooding thing you mentioned is a problem that the Nigerian government is conversant with. It didn't just happen this year alone. It has been happening in the last 5-6 years. It's unfortunate that we haven't had a government who is capable enough to understand that they have to put in place a framework that will help give an early warning system and address it as it happens. And then the kind of investment you put in places like that is investment that can mitigate and then at least adapt to the flood when it happens. But unfortunately, that hasn't happened. If you look, for example, all the states where the flooding happened, take Bayelsa, for example. If you check their annual budget, how much goes into environment or flooding control or mitigation project, you will be shocked and embarrassed. So when such things happen and the state governors are crying, you wonder where they want people to help them. If you can't help yourself, who will help you? Nobody's going to help you. So like my recommendation would be that annually, state government, like Bayelsa State, all the states where the flood has affected, they should try as much as possible to look into a process that will put in place a signal that will show that at least there is an internal commitment financially that they put in place. If it's just awareness raising and then building a resilience that will show, so that when even this foreign donor fund or that kind of damage, lose and damage fund comes in, they can at least have an existing framework they can fit into. But a situation where internally within the country, even the little that was invested through ecological fund is all stories around it. It doesn't give the right signal. And I think this is a really one thing we must take very seriously. The state governors should invest in mitigation and adaptation projects. They should invest in things that will send a signal that the state is also conversant with the Paris Agreement, because state, the sub-regional units can do something to show leadership. If you look, for example, in the United States, California is showing leadership on environmental issues. It doesn't matter even if Abuja refuses to take the right step. Don't wait until Abuja respond, because at the end of the day in Bayelsa, when the community were floating on top of water, it wasn't the Abuja people that were floating on water. It is the people. So the governor cannot be waiting for Abuja to respond before he deals with the challenge in his community, in his village. So I really will appeal to the state governors. And the NGF Forum can do something by bringing all the states together to build forces together, and so that they can harness their problem, to use it to build a framework that will attract other attentions and support. So the first thing they need to do is to first of all look into their internal budget system and see how they allocate more resources into mitigation and adaptation projects, and see how they can design a kind of a state level NDC, National Determined Commitment. They should have their own commitment at the state level, where they can see how they can develop policies that can also give signal that they are prepared. You know, that preparedness is something that is very good. It sends the right signal. And if you don't do that, your people become victims of this crisis we are talking about. It's only when you have not visited Bayelsa. Now, as we speak, the entire road linking Bayelsa East-West Road to Port Harcourt has been wiped out because of the flood. You can imagine the damage. You can imagine how it also shows clearly that when they were designing those roads, they don't take into consideration that that environment require a kind of a mitigation plan. And so you can see what it has cost now. You know what that means. You know the financial implication to put back that road, the East-West Road. So the more the government is investing in a road that is not environment compliant, that does not meet some level that will face the risk that is associated with roads that are in those ecological area, then there's a problem. So the same thing across the entire country. State governments should rise up to the challenge. They should not wait for Abuja. If they continue to wait for Abuja, their people will suffer. And once their people suffer, it becomes unfortunate. And I also want to appeal to the people as well too. You know, you can't have a governor to be responsible when you don't rise up to hold him accountable. When governors normally have their way, they have the House of Assembly in their pocket, they have the judiciary in their pocket, they will never listen to you. They will choose when to spend their money. But if the people rise up to their challenge, civil society, community-based organization, media, just like what TVC is exactly doing, raising an awareness. For example, why we should make it an issue. We're going to presidential election in 2023. Why will the issue of climate change not be an issue during the election? We must be able to ask the presidential candidates what would be their manifesto, what would be their policy agenda to address the Paris Agreement on climate change. Now, the flooding that has happened, have they commissioned a study? Because, you know, you have presidents who emerge, they make promises, and they don't know the impact, and they don't have the resources to fulfill their promises. I expect by as we speak now that the presidential candidate of the major political parties or the presidential candidate that are contesting election should have asked their intellectual powerhouse to commission a study to look into the damage caused by the flood and see how they can come up with a blueprint. But unfortunately, that will not happen. What you will hear from the presidential candidate, when you elect me as a president or you elect me as a governor, I will address the flooding problem. It will not happen again. How will it not happen again when you don't know even the extent of the damage? You don't even know the history of the problem. But because you want to appeal to the conscience of the people, you want to appeal to the mind of the people to buy their vote. And that's why every leadership is a function of his people. The people must mobilize. Civil society must commission study. As we speak now, no study has been done into the damages caused by the recent flood in Nigeria. All we just see we band figures around.
Reverend, you spoke earlier about government having a framework to addressing matters of flooding, especially when issues of environmental challenges come up, and also having early warning signals. One would say that that is already in place with regards to what NIMET does, always speaking about the levels of rainfall that the country would have before it even begins. And then we also have state National Emergency Management Agency. Isn't this a framework of some sort that had been put in place by government? And speaking of state government addressing these matters, how are NGOs like yours putting state governments on their toes to address these matters?
Thank you very much. Let's walk the talk. Like you rightly noted, all those policies are in place. But you can see from your own eye, you saw when the flood happened. You saw what happened in Bayelsa State. You saw what happened in other states where the flood had a negative impact. In the Niger State, across all those regions, you saw what happened. Now, will you say that the early warning system worked? If the early system worked, will you be seeing people floating on the river? You will not see that. Government, the kind of project that will be put in place, entire road, the east-west road between Bayelsa and Port Harcourt was wiped away. Will the government not take into consideration in putting a climate resilient project in place? That didn't happen. So my call is that in future, and as we move forward, we should always take into consideration that when government design a policy, it must take into consideration some of these issues. So when the early warning systems are working very well, for example, projects that are located in areas where when flood happens, it could affect, the mitigation plan should be very clear from day one in reaching out to the people, in carrying out the people around. And as you rightly noted, the civil society role is awareness raising, advocacy, campaigning. When things are not working, we raise an awareness. And where we need more bold initiative, we also advocate for it. We are not government. We can't claim to replace government. And our role is to also influence policy and see our project can also be put in a place, particularly for the vulnerable ones. And once you have a government that does not listen, there's nothing you can do, except you continue to put the pressure. And that's exactly what we're doing in our advocacy and campaign raising. Now, if you look the kind of government institutions that are in place, the emergency that is going on, they need to be held accountable. They need to explain to Nigerians when funds are allocated, the National Assembly oversight role need to come out very strongly. For example, after the flooding now the National Assembly need to organize a public hearing to see areas where they didn't perform very well, an area they performed very well, they need to be praised. An area they didn't perform very well, how can we improve on them? These are how you improve deepening governance, because there's no one size fit it all in dealing with challenges that is associated with environmental crisis. Everywhere around the world, when it happens, government rise to the challenge to deal with them. And Nigeria is not an exception. So my call and my appeal to the Nigerian government, both at the federal, the state, and the local government level, they all have responsibility to play to deal with this challenge. And if everyone works together as a team, we can all resolve this problem. The multinational oil company that has gone back home now, laughing with joy and happiness because they declare huge profit as a result of the windfall they made from the Ukraine crisis. But the poor people of the Niger Delta are faced with the negative impact of the gas flaring, the negative impact of oil pollution. But Chevron, Shell are declaring huge profit across the world. You see, the irony is very unfortunate, and this is really the big missing link in the test that came out from. Yes.
You're talking about the states and so on. Tell us the role of corruption and the role of religion in all of this, because we're talking about climate change. Most people don't even know what the heck is climate change. They just see that the rain falls and they are swamped, and they start holding their Bibles and Qurans and saying that, the devil has come and has come to take our joy away and things like that. The people need to understand first before they can even protest. They don't feel that it's the government's problem that the rain fell and it swamped them. They think that it's the devil. So you need to bring all of that. You're talking about states. States need to do a lot of work, as you said. But the center has to do something and set the tone. The states, even when Lagos, for instance, we are talking about the swamping of the country. You know that if Lagos had not taken steps as they have taken to control the drainage, do all the works about retracing all the movement of water down to the ocean, you didn't know that Lagos would have been a worse case than Kogi or Bayelsa. So we need a situation where the states will have to do something, but we need to take care of corruption. We have to take care of enlightenment first. What do you say?
Well, I completely agree with you that the issue of corruption and enlightenment, awareness raising is very important. Coincidentally, studies and research have proven that corruption correlates with underdevelopment. And so there is a correlation. As an anti-corruption expert, I have found literatures who provide such evidence that where countries or any community or any country where corruption is a big problem, the level of underdevelopment, governance issue, including environmental issues, are problems. So they correlate. And because resources that are supposed to be using to build an environment resilient project can be going to private pocket. And that's what you are seeing in Nigeria. If you look, the investigations around the ecological fund, for example, in Nigeria, is a big problem. Like the Niger Delta Development Commission that was created to help sustain development in the Niger Delta, you have seen how forensic audit have proven how individuals are even richer than NDDC as we speak today in the Niger Delta. So corruption is a major problem. At the national level, the emergency fund that are supposed to be going to the poor people are going to private pockets. And that's a big problem. So corruption is a major problem in Nigeria. Whether we will achieve the Paris Agreement on climate change, corruption will play a major role. And the governance system, the framework, will play a major role. There's no doubt. And issue of awareness of the people is a major issue. And that's where the human rights, civil society, community-based organizations come in. The media houses comes in. And like you said, what is climate change? You know, it's something we need to really break down for people to understand. But there's no better way to explain to the people than the flooding that have just happened. It is caused as a result of climate change problem. There are different gases that contribute to climate change problem, and carbon dioxide is one of them. And you know, the gas flaring in the Niger Delta region generates some of these gases that help warm the global system, and that contributes to the greenhouse gases that contributes to this global warming. And that's what climate change is all about. And the people need to understand that rivers where they were going to fish before, they can no longer access those rivers. Some of those rivers are dried up as a climate change. If you are flying into the country from the northern part of the country, you will see what desertification is actually doing to the country. Almost half of the country, if not even 3/4 of the country, is gone as a result of desertification. And increasingly, it's leading to the conflict between the northern brothers who are involved in the cow business and the farmers. Right. And when you see the cow business and the farmers conflict you see in the country, these are all part of the problem. So issue of awareness raising is very fundamental. Issue of corruption is as well a very important issue that contributes to the problem in the country. But how do we deal with the challenge? Election is coming in 2023. What are the political party positions on these issues? And how do people cast their vote? If you look all the debate that is going on, I heard in the news before we came in, the 5 governors, the integrity group. What are they talking about?
Reverend
These are issues that we must. Yes.
Yes, we have to leave the conversation here now because we have run out of time. But we must thank you, Environmentalist and Executive Director of African Network for Environment and Economic Justice, for your time on the program.
Thank you very much.
All right.